Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and this is the Backlog. This week I finished off Neptunia x Senran Kagura Ninja Wars, a crossover between the two series in the title. I've always really liked Senran Kagura. I picked up Shinovi Versus way back on the PSP for the novelty of it, and while it did have the high levels of fan service that I assumed, it was a lot more fun and better made than I expected, so I've been a fan ever since. When it came to Hyperdimension Neptunia though, I watched someone play it for about an hour once, and then never played it myself. I gave it a second chance when they did an anime for it though, and thought it was somewhere between mediocre and underwhelming. So as you can probably guess, I was way more invested in the other half of this collaboration. I had a few misgivings because of this, especially since it seemed that most of the work was done on the part of the Neptunia studio, but my curiosity wouldn't let me ignore this one. The story is simple enough, there being two ninja nations warring to destroy each other's Share Stone, which serves as the country's source of power. On one side you have the Compa Nation, represented by Neptune, Vert, Noir, and Blanc for the Neptunia franchise, and on the other, the Honeypa Nation, which has Asuka, Homura, Yumi, and Miyabi from Senran Kagura. Then some other folks show up in a flying saucer and declare war on the world to see who will emerge as the ultimate ninja. There are a few other Neptunia characters that show up in cutscenes and little dialogue blurbs, as well as original characters serving as the enemies, side characters, and one playable, with another gender-bent character from some other game I've never heard of thrown in. As you can probably guess, the story focuses more on the Neptunia side of things. There are 4 representatives being playable from the get-go, and the rest of the cast being unlocked as an alliance is struck. As for the actual plot though, it's alright. There's a fair bit of references to the source material, again with more from the Neptunia side, so your mileage will vary based on your familiarity with both. There's also a fair bit of meta humor and video game references, which will either be a hit or miss for just about everybody. The whole thing doesn't take itself too seriously and largely tries to keep things silly and fun. It's nothing groundbreaking, but I'd say it's somewhere between tolerable and enjoyable. There are 2 big marks against it though. The first is just how much dialogue there is. About 2/3 of the main game is just clicking through dialogue boxes, and if you do enough of the side missions, that might knock it down to about half instead. The game is classified as an action RPG, but this kinda makes it seem almost like more of a visual novel. The other thing is just how low budget its presentation is. Each character has only a few stills to represent them during dialogue, and each part of their faces are slapped on to create a handful of basic expressions and animations like blinking and mouth movements. These can come across as either acceptable or horrendous, and can be pretty hard to look at. Then there's how the action scenes work. Sometimes you'll get a CG, typically either something fan servicey or the type of thing you'd use for promotional art, and these tend to look half decent. More often than not though, it's just more of the stills with basic facial movements tacked on, and they either imply or just tell you what's happening. Sometimes this leads to projected sequences like where the cast needs to get across a deep ravine, so one character uses their ninja kite to fly across while carrying a rope of considerable weight, reaching the other side and securing the line so that the rest can cross over, all while everyone else discusses what's happening in a bit of detail, which feels kinda silly and a little surreal. Then there's also scenes where a good bit of epic action is allegedly going on, like when Homura fights a giant robot guy and we're left to just take their word that what's going on is really stinking cool and please believe them. Another simple CGI really would have been enough to make a lot of these scenes a little less ridiculous and more believable. Even the opening, with its fancy anime-sounding song, fell victim to this, with a bunch of still images and minimal animation techniques thrown in, making it feel more like a fancy PowerPoint. And just when I thought the game was done surprising me with stuff like this, I got to the game's credits, which seems to be where the entire animation budget went for this game. You get another Japanese track that's pretty peppy, and accompanying the list of people who worked on the game, you get a series of beautiful pixel animations, parodying some pretty famous NES titles, and it's easily the best looking anything in this game. While I'm not complaining about the sequence itself, I am quite baffled at why they seem to have saved the real attention grabber for the very end of the experience, and if they couldn't have put maybe just a little bit of this effort into the rest of the scenes. And then the secondary aspect of this game, combat. You have a standard attack button that you can mash for a combo. You have a set of kunai and shuriken that you can swap between for ranged attacks, though they do have ammo that you have to wait for to refill, so spamming is limited. You have a jump. You have a dash. You can guard. You can lock on to focus on one specific enemy. You can go into levels with 2 characters that you can swap between. You have special attacks that you can use and different attack modes you can activate for different pros and cons. You have a special meter that you can build up for a really big attack. It sounds like a lot, but how does it work in execution? Kind of awkward, at least in my opinion. First off, you always want to use your range. It's free damage, and if you attack from behind, you actually get bonus power to your attack, which is much easier to do at a distance. So if you're holding onto your kunai and shuriken, you're wasting them. As for your regular attack, you really only have one basic combo that you mash to pull off, no lights, mids, or heavies to create unique chains. You can kinda string together some of your special attacks, which you can mix and match to have a roster of up to 4 of at once. Activating one soon after another will grant you some bonus, but given that each one has a cost to your stamina meter, which is also required for dashing, you can only use them so many times in a row. Not only that, but there is a lot of startup and cooldown for not only these, but your standard combo as well, and there's no way I found to quickly cancel out, so not only is it impossible to pull off a quick combo, but it's also really easy to get sucker punched either before, during, or after one of your moves, though getting hit while doing a special does seem to lessen the damage a bit, so it's better than taking a hit head on. Your big ninja attack, though, that you have to build up, does seem to give you some invincibility when that plays out, so that's nice, and on top of that, it does a ton of damage as you'd expect. The different combat forms you get give trade-offs like higher attack at the cost of defense. There are 4 different forms and you can only use them a few times per stage, so I tried them out a few times, then started saving them for when I really needed them, then forgot about them when I actually did need them, and only remembered now when I was going back over the controls that they even existed. The lock-on kind of sucks. The game tells you that it goes on to whatever is closest, but that's either a lie or a mistranslation, and instead it focuses on whatever's the most directly kind of vaguely in front of you. And when you are locked on, that's the only thing you can attack unless something places itself between you and your target, everything you do tractor beaming in on what's in your sight. If there's an enemy you want to attack just off to your right that you want to make sure your special attack hits, but there's something more directly in your line of sight 50 feet away, too bad you're going after the distant one. You can cycle through targets, but if something isn't in the frame enough, trying to home in on it is a lost cause. For defensive options, you have a dash, but your movements aren't really the fastest, and you can still get hit even if you dodge perfectly if the attack is big enough or has enough homing on it. The guard, on the other hand, will reduce damage if you hold it, and completely negate attacks if you time it perfectly. This was kind of a point of frustration for me, since I much prefer dodging to blocking, especially after playing Kirby in the Forgotten Land a few weeks back where the dodge roll was the end-all be-all. Overall, the combat feels really clunky and sometimes ill thought out. You're not terribly fast. Sometimes enemies are scattered around and you can get hit by something off-screen, the minimap not even helping if they strike from enough of a range. Sometimes they place enemy with Gatling guns in a corridor, so that there's not enough room to dodge their attack and not enough time to rush them down before they reload. Some of the bosses also are really rough. Some have range, dodge around quickly, and can even teleport, making it almost impossible to attack them from a distance and an ordeal to get in close yourself before they chew through your health. They also have a break meter that you can wear down to stagger them, but if you attack from the front, it typically refills faster than you can knock it down. And it can be hard enough to attack their back that isn't too helpful either. I think I managed to get this off on the first few bosses, but it stopped being a thing not too far into the game, at least as far as I was concerned. Sometimes foes also can get glitched out of bounds. This only happened to me twice, and I managed to find a workaround each time. The first, me using my super special to hit something that trapped itself behind the wall, and the second, me hitting a boss that teleported behind a blocked off doorway with a shuriken, though unfortunately it also finished off their break meter, and when they teleported back into the arena, they were far enough away that it pretty much wasted my attack window. Nothing game breaking, but I would have had to restart the level had I not found a solution by throwing everything at the wall. It's a little hard for me to critique the gameplay because while it did often feel clunky, damage cheap, and some bosses unplay-tested, I have to acknowledge that it didn't suit my preferred playstyle, so maybe if it had clicked with me more or I had taken more time to learn the ins and outs, it might have been more palatable. But as it stands, there was a lot of frustration here for me, and I really don't think there's any defending, even with this allowance, the lock-on and bugs. As for the supplemental stuff, you do level up to gain more strength and special attacks to equip to your wheel. Experience is largely shared, though the characters you use do get a bit more. I ended the game in the 40s, and there was about a 2-level gap between those that I played with almost exclusively compared to those I rarely touched. Miyabi from Senran Kagura was my go-to because her combo was half decent and she had one special attack that just wrecked even the mid-bosses. and while I swapped my secondary several times, I eventually settled on Vert, because her weapon reminded me of Darth Maul, and she was also just so darn attractive, though she did have some questionable, preferences that did make me question my choice. Maybe Homura or Yumi would have been better. There are consumable items you have to either recover health or give yourself a buff. I never reached the limit on how many you could have in your inventory, though there was a cap on how many you could take into a stage, so you couldn't just recover forever. You could also equip different throwing weapons to customize things like attacking, speed, damage, effects, and reload time, and you could also equip up to 2 charms per characters. Most of the buffs these perform are only active at either full health or almost dead, so I didn't pick and choose these too carefully, other than the one that massively cut down the stamina cost of specials, which I immediately threw on Miyabi to great effect. There are also gems that you can equip for buffs, like added damage to some attacks, or against some enemies, increased experience, or recovery. You can combine lower level gems to create ones with better effects, and the number you can equip at once also increases as you level up. Finally, there's a mini-game where you get scantily clad in an onsen and have to balance on an inflatable peach, and if you complete the session, you get a buff that lasts a few levels. All of these systems can be helpful, but as you probably expect, the most surefire way to make the game easier to get through is by leveling up. If you're having trouble, your best bet is to grind out some experience by taking on some of the side missions. As you can probably gather, I wasn't the biggest fan of this game. It seemed a little too low budget, I didn't enjoy the combat as much as I'd wish, and the ratio between action and dialogue was skewed in the opposite direction of what I thought it'd be. That last one made things especially awkward since I streamed all of the main game, and while I'm open to voicing characters, when there are around 20 of them, mostly female, and you have a voice like mine, the task is a bit daunting. So most of the stream was just me making jokes about what's going on. And don't get me wrong, that's not to say that I didn't have fun with the game. I did have a good bit quipping at the dialogue, and while the combat wasn't as fast-paced as I'd like, it was mostly manageable, and it was kinda fun sniping enemies with my shuriken and then getting in close to have Miyabi one-punch an enemy or two if I could group them up. It just wasn't the sort of thing that I should have streamed, and when things did get hard, it could feel unfair and supremely frustrating. Really, my biggest takeaway from playing the crossover was just how much I really like the Senran Kagura games proper. With the exception of the first title and some of the spin-offs, each one tends to have better combat, better gameplay, better story, better character designs, better openings and CGs, better enemy variety, just a better all-around experience. Like I said before, I picked up Senran Kagura with 0 expectations beside jiggle physics, and it delivered on that while exceeding in every other department. Neptunia x Senran Kagura was worth it for me from a curiosity standpoint, and I would still pick up any sequels for the same reason, but this couldn't hold my interest beyond the credits. If you're interested in getting into either of these series, I can't really speak on Neptunia, but for the Senran Kagura side of things, play Shinovi Versus, play Estival Versus, play Deep Crimson, but skip on this unless you become a diehard later down the line. The whole time I was playing this game, I was just thinking about how much I'd rather be playing one of the aforementioned titles. And continuing with Castlevania, this time with the Castlevania Adventure, originally for Gameboy. It's another Belmont quest to kill Dracula, this one being another Simon outing, I think. This one was the most manageable thus far, for 2 big reasons. The first is that they seem to take the Game Boy's limitations into account and kind of temper their expectation of you. There's a lot less on screen to dodge around, and most of the enemies have simpler movement patterns. The power-ups have been a bit dumbed down, which is a mixed blessing. On one hand, you don't have any of the cool sub-weapons, which is a letdown. On the other hand, health is easier to come by, and the different stages of the whip work cooler. There are 3 levels like normal, the standard being, well, standard, the second being a bit longer, and the third adding a projectile. Having something you can shoot off is huge in a game like this. Even with the smaller screen, it's still really easy to take out most enemies before they get too close. On the other hand, if you do get hit, your whip gets downgraded by 1, so how long you hold on to the stronger versions and how helpful they even are depend largely on you. The bosses in this game, with the exception of the last, who hovers at an odd altitude, are much easier to deal with, and if you do manage to reach them with a fully upgraded whip, it almost makes you seem like a bully. The other thing making this game seem a bit more of a reprieve is its length. It's probably the Game Boy's limits again, but there are fewer levels, so if you're either good at the game or have access to save states, it shouldn't take too long, maybe an hour, to tackle this. And don't get me wrong, there are still some really tricky parts in this game. Maybe it was the game's grays getting me down, but I was feeling Simon's weight a lot more in this one, in both his walk speed and jumping ability, making things seem not only slow going, but also making some bouts of platforming seem nigh impossible. There's also a time limit for each stage, which I never had to contend with due to save scumming, but it did make Simon's brisk pace really funny, as he ambled along like he didn't have a care in the world and nowhere major to be. There's also some really tricky bits, like some auto-scrolling, moving platforms, and a few ill-placed enemies only exacerbating what I already said. But hey, there's no stairs in this one, being perhaps the biggest contributor to the drop in difficulty here. Overall, though, it's kind of the most forgettable of the Castlevanias I played. The first was hard, but solid and definitely the one that I enjoyed most. The second was a valiant attempt to change things up that I don't think quite worked out, which is why I dropped it. The third started out nice, but then devolved into rage-inducing bullcrap. Kid Dracula was just weird and seemed like an ill-advised attempt to ape better games. Adventure just seems like a dumbed-down, less impressive version of the first, and the lack of color palette didn't do much to help. While it wasn't bad, it wasn't really good either, and I'd only recommend it if you already have access to it, because at that point, why not, right? It was fine for what it was. So we're back down to 108. Soon it'll be down to just double digits, or at least I hope. While I'm planning on doing another Castlevania, I haven't planned out next week beyond that, so I guess it'll be a surprise for me too. So hey, look forward to that, and maybe subscribe if you like this sort of thing, and as always, thanks for watching. See ya!